you alluded to the difference between psilocybin and antidepressants. And I have the impression that I think from listening to your talks that we have a similar conception of what depression is. And I find we're in an interesting moment where I think people like yourself who have kind of unearthed the root causes behind depression and kind of addressed it often have a better understanding of what this disorder is than a lot of academics studying it with a kind of a distance in a intellectual framework with a lot of momentum behind it from kind of, pharmaceutical sales and all this other stuff leads to quite a reductionist kind of way of viewing depression as this kind of, oh, it's a physical, spontaneous imbalance of chemicals in your brain. And so in the academic literature, I see a lot of confusion and people not having kind of deep insight into what it is. But yeah, I feel like in your work, you show a kind of an understanding of the kind of what goes on behind depression a lot of the time, possibly not in every case, but that it can be kind of rooted in complex trauma and just our emotional struggles. It's a kind of richer understanding of suffering, really, right? Instead of seeing it as this kind of spontaneous, strange disorder, it makes sense. It's a manifest, it's a version of suffering. So yeah, perhaps you could say something about your perspective on depression and the difference between antidepressants and psilocybin.
Yeah, there's a lot of avenues there. Okay, so let's see if I can chop some down one by one, see what happens. Antidepressants and psilocybin. So antidepressants, SSRI antidepressants. The way I talked about it in the book, the way I talked about it in Decomposing the Shadow was something like SSRIs sort of blunt the depression. So they remove the symptoms of the depression. I mean, obviously not for everyone, otherwise we wouldn't have such a thing as treatment-resistant depression. And that psilocybin, instead of trying to blunt them, forces you, or we'll say strongly encourages you to process the underlying emotional issues that are giving rise to the depression. And in Decomposing the Shadow, I had a language then that I wouldn't use so much now. I've grown a lot as a person and also as an amateur psychedelic scholar, right? And at the time, I said it had a lot to do with emotional repression, emotions that we were holding down, holding back, that we were conditioned to sort of keep in or react to in a certain way. And although that makes sense now, I would think of it maybe slightly differently, which is that the feeling function of our body, our emotional system, gets sort of set up in a way where certain feelings are responded to in certain ways that are adaptive at the moment in which it was necessary to deal with them in that way early in life, but then get established and sort of hidden, sewn within our identity, and then they get stuck there. And then as we get older, those same adaptive responses and the perceptions we had at the time become the sort of the models that we have for interacting with similar feelings and similar circumstances later in life in a way that is maladaptive, because the unresolved emotional past and the perceptions that were seated then, what Douglas Tataran calls accidental conditioned history, becomes a veil that distorts our ability to interact and understand what's actually happening. And so we respond to events as if they were the same then, warranting the same defensive reactions, which that's not necessarily the case. And so it becomes maladaptive. But I'll use a metaphor that I got from Gabor Mate, and I'll expand on it a little bit for myself, which is that if we are born in like Antarctica, for example, it's absolutely necessary for us to wear a parka. It's cold outside, right? And when we get older, if we fly to Mexico, right, or that parka is our defenses, right? If we fly to Mexico, and we don't take that parka off, then it becomes harmful. The parka is a maladaptive response to the climate, to the weather of our lives. But it's hard to take the parka off because you learned very early on that it was too cold outside. That if you take the parka off, you'll be harmed, you'll die. I mean, for a kid, you know, having an experience, or we'll just say nothing too extreme. I mean, like extreme abuse is not a whole other world, but it's a more significant sort of discussion maybe. But from a place of like certain feelings not be allowed to be felt, or certain sort of feelings that are present as a consequence of a distorted attunement between you and your parents, that there's like a primal panic there. The infant, the child, it knows that it needs the parent on a nervous system, on like an instinctive level, and then on a psychological level, being egocentric, you know, whatever's wrong in the dynamic, that means primal panic of like, oh, I'm going to die, you know, I'm going to die if I don't get this loving connection. They also perceive it as their own fault. They're not able to be like, oh, mommy's acting this way because she's stressed about work. Mommy's acting this way because I'm a bad boy, right? So I have to be a good boy, something like that. Or daddy's acting this way. It doesn't matter. Point is, you get the concept. And so when we get to Mexico later, we've got this thing that from a primal panic has said we can't take it off, even though we're now dying inside of it. And it gets even more complicated when we've had the parka on for so long that we don't even recognize that we're wearing it, right? And so we just walk around constantly hot and bothered and suffering, you know, having weird interactions with others, you know, that makes us feel hot and bothered and suffering, but we can't see that it's because we're wearing this parka, and another part of us wants us to not see it. So that might be some kind of metaphor that may or may not link up with the flow that kind of got disrupted thanks to the internet gremlins. So yeah, how does this relate to depression? So, I mean, there's a lot of different people, I think, talking about depression as like as a consequence, say, of early life emotional trauma. I recently interviewed a guy who does ketamine assisted somatic psychotherapy, and he had a whole model about sort of how to heal trauma, or sorry, how to heal depression as a consequence of early life traumas, developmental trauma, with ketamine assisted somatic therapy. And I've heard other people talk about it in different ways, like Douglas Ataran talks about it as, you know, we get to a place where we learn to repress certain emotions because they're not safe to feel in ourselves. We don't know how to feel them because they're scary. They're not safe to feel them because we're afraid they'll hurt others, or others will hurt us as a consequence, whatever it is. So we hold them in. And if you are repeatedly repressing an emotion over and over and over again, the system eventually automatizes, whatever. And then eventually it becomes depression. And it's something like, if your system is perpetually having to hold down your emotions, and your emotional system, your feeling function, is as important a part of yourself as a human being as your thinking. You know, and so if your nervous system is perpetually needing to respond to keep something down, then eventually, once it automatizes it, then it just sort of, everything starts to go down. So you just become down and down and down and down and down, and then nothing means anything anymore. And there's no emotional capacity for hope. There's no emotional capacity to even like feel like it makes sense to even get out of bed. Of course, you could talk then too about how the chronic stress that would come out of that would produce long-term effects on the brain tissue and your ability even to think yourself out. Well, we can't really think ourselves out of ruts typically, but like there's a lot of things that would say this is what depression is. Depression is a set of symptoms. Those symptoms can come from a number of places, but the problem isn't the depression. You know, the problem isn't the symptoms of the depression. The problem is somewhere deeper. And when you take antidepressants, it can help to mitigate the problem of the symptoms. And in biological psychiatry, the problem is that something's wrong with your brain. And so you change your brain and the symptoms go away and the problem is solved. Where a different approach, something akin to where I'm coming from as a, like I said, amateur psychedelic scholar on the internet. So take it or leave it as you would. I could give links to people with more reputable letters at the end of their name to support my thoughts here, but is that there's something deeper going on, and that something deeper needs to be processed, and not just processed, but processed and given a different meaningness. And from that, you open yourself up to being able to conduct yourself in life differently, to lay new patterns, new adaptive patterns, so that you could show up with less distortion. And that with psilocybin, I suggest that it's because psilocybin dismantles the invisible walls that block us from ourselves, and in doing so, reveal what's already there in a way that we can let it out. We can fully embody it. Something like Stanislav Grof said, the funeral pyre of an emotion is the fullest expression of that emotion. We're able to like really let it out. And it's not just we're letting it out. This is something I gave a talk on this at the Psychedelic Psychotherapy 2014. The power went out, and I don't know if the recording ever went out or what, but I had said that this is happening, but it's not just happening on its own. It's also happening while you're being held pharmacologically, you could say, but also subjectively, you're being held by an other that is bringing a quality of awareness to your process that gives it a different meaning. I'm not just suffering again. I'm suffering while being held by the mushroom. And so now what my suffering means is different. It's not the same as it was then. I'm also an adult now. I get to have the experience of letting it go while also almost reconsolidating the meaningness of the events that led to whatever it was that became my depression. And so those emotions can come up, and I can develop a new relationship with those emotions and a new meaninged relationship with the events that caused them. And that's held by the mushroom, or it's held by the sense of isness or the sense of the divine or whatever it is that mushrooms awaken. And that the consequence of that is that, you would feel less depressive symptoms. A lot of that gets let go. It's like you're lighter now. Your system is lighter. I mean, there's some stuff there about the neurochemistry and having a greater capacity to a greater capacity for agency during emotionally conflicting information, in like the sort of 30-day long tail effect of on the brain after psilocybin. But ultimately, there's this greater capacity now, because you're no longer sort of bearing the load of those things in the same way you were now. And in Decomposing the Shadow, I described it as your shadow as the unknown or rejected or unwanted or unseen aspects of yourself, which includes shitty behaviors, but it also includes emotions that you'd rather not feel, and trauma and wounds and all the rest. And that, like Jung said, something like, we all have a shadow, and if we don't reveal it, then it'll play itself out in life and we'll call it fate. It's that if we don't do anything about that shadow stuff, it starts to wear down on our lives. And the way that it ends up coming out when it's stuck inside is in a way that also bears a burden onto others in our relationships. And with psilocybin, the shadow can be revealed, it can be processed. I don't know how I feel about this term anymore, but in the book, I called it emotive psychosynthesis. So it was based on psychosynthesis from Asiligo, this like Italian psychologist whose name I can't remember right now, which is that we have all these different sub-personalities that get awakened at different times. And psychosynthesis is a core personality, recognizing and integrating those sub-personalities. So maybe something akin to what IFS is talking about with the multiplicity of the mind. And I added the emotive on there because it's about bringing up those emotional pieces and integrating them through feeling them, which is also processing them. So it's like the shadow places, the emotions that we haven't felt, be they from 5 years old or be they from a stressful week that we just keep convincing ourselves we're fine, they become like undigested food in our stomachs. And eventually they start rotting there. And as a consequence of them rotting there, we tend to become distorted expressions of ourselves, and those distortions end up manipulating the way we conduct ourselves in our relationships, which causes perpetual conflict, which causes more, or like can perpetuate conflict, which causes then more shadow stuff to get all balled up and whatever else, blah, blah, blah. And with psilocybin, the mushroom comes in, it opens up whatever defenses we have from not feeling those things, and we can feel those things like digesting the food through emotive psychosynthesis. We process those feelings. And like I said, in the context of being held, new meaning perception, blah, blah, blah. And that's why the book is called Decomposing the Shadow. Mushrooms are decomposers in the forest. The mushroom comes in and it starts to decompose the shadow. And what happens with decomposition? Well, what happens with decomposition is that stuff that should no longer be the way that it is because it's dead, it's over, if it's stuck there, anyways, it decomposes it and it frees nutrients. Mushrooms decompose things and free nutrients into the soil. And so those nutrients are freed up into the soil of yourself as a tree. We can consider ourselves like a tree. And so the raw nutrients released as a consequence of decomposing the shadow is the levity, the capacity, the agency we can then use to apply into our life to change the patterns that were an expression of the distorted whatevers from our past, so as to not put ourselves back in that situation eventually. If we don't do that, then we're likely to land on the other side of it, more or less where we were when we first started. This is the point of integration. No surprise to any of your listeners that matters. Is there anything else there? Let me say this one other thing about being a tree and the shadow. Robert Augustus Masters, beautiful psychotherapist, spiritual psychotherapist kind of man. I love his work. He wrote a book called Spiritual Bypassing. Highly recommend anyone into psychedelics read Spiritual Bypassing by Robert Augustus Masters. We're all doing it in some degree or another. And even if we think that we're all done, we'll discover later that we're doing it somewhere else. But he talks about the self as a tree, with lower emotions being our roots and higher emotions being our branches. And this isn't lower or higher in this sort of judgmental higher is better, lower is worse. It's more like lower because when you're sad or in grief or in hopelessness, generally it feels lower, it feels like it has gravity. Where when you're in joy, elation, what would be like hope or it feels a little more levity, more effervescent in a way. And so we want to obviously grow our branches of higher emotions really bright, big, nice, thick foliage, blossom trees. But we can't, or blossom flowers, but we can't do that if our root structures aren't deep enough into the earth to bring those nutrients up. And so the way that we grow our roots, the way that we grow our branches is by feeling those things in a healthy way. And if we're not feeling the dark parts of ourselves, if they're stuck there, or we're just unable to feel the lower emotions without sort of repressing and clenching against them, then they don't grow. And so our blossoms will never be able to bloom as brightly as they could, even if we're working really hard. The capacity just isn't there. And additionally, when a storm comes, and a storm always comes, the likelihood of our tree getting knocked over if our root structures aren't deep, is good, is high, right? And so with the psilocybin, there's not only just the letting go of the past stuff, there's a quintessential learning in there about the value, for example, the value of sadness, the value of feeling sad when sadness comes, the value of grieving at the arrival of loss. The value of grieving as an extension of recognizing simply by having things will leave, or the value of being heartbroken, the value of allowing yourself to feel hopeless, because all of these things, the feelings themselves aren't bad. They're not to be rejected. They deepen us. If we're only stuck there, of course, that's not going to vibe, but there's something there quintessential about the psilocybin experience, as far as I have come to model it and experience it, is about not only, hey, we need to get these old stuck stuff out of us. It's like, oh, we also have to come to recognize that the embracing, the what is it, Trungpa and the Shambhala tradition said something like, to experience unflinchingly also the difficulty of life, the sadness, for example, is a great example, because it's easy to be like happy, good, sad, bad, you know. Yeah, okay. Oh, wow, rant over. You're a very good listener. Yeah.
No, that was wonderful. And there was a lot there, yeah, that really resonates. I mean, especially the title of your book, Decomposing the Shadow. Before I was familiar with that title, I had a very similar experience with psilocybin of getting in touch with a kind of a core issue for me, which was a kind of, so, you know, as you know, when you're kind of overwhelmed, you can have kind of fight response, flight response, but also a freeze response. And so for me, that was a kind of strategy when I was very young. And so I have a kind of like traumatized breathing kind of response where breathing goes very tight and I kind of, yeah, and then it gets kind of gasping. And so I was very much getting in touch with that on one psilocybin journey, and staying with it for a very long time, and identifying with it until I felt this kind of separation from this part of me that was no longer serving me. As you said, it's not like, why is it still here? It's not relevant anymore. And I saw it as just this kind of dead or like dying creature that didn't need to be here. And I remember feeling like, well, what am I going to do with this thing? And then the idea came to me, oh, I'll compost it. And then that way, when I feel these sensations, you know, if I feel a tightness and a gasping, I don't have to think, oh, that's that, you know, irrelevant, annoying part of me that I wish wasn't there. I can say, oh, okay, that allows me to think, well, what can I do to release it? And then use that energy to kind of reinvest in myself. And that was a really powerful psilocybin experience. And yeah, I think it's a pretty neat parallel with your analogy of decomposing the shadow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of goes into what I was saying before about the psilocybin. The psilocybin is playing a significant role. I mean, we could talk about it pharmacologically or subjectively. I like to put character form to psilocybin. I think it is valuable at the very least from like a Pascal's wager perspective. I think it holds utility to interact with it as if it were a thing without disempowering ourselves by overly projecting our own authority onto it. Which is that, you know, when you had that moment, you were feeling the feeling, and psilocybin was holding you in that until the manner in which it was holding you offered you its angle on the thing, which is yours, because you and it are one in this sort of like symbiotic dance in the moment that it's pharmacologically alive in you, possibly onwards afterwards if we want to talk about the spirit of a thing, but that doesn't need to be discussed. And it gave you this angle. It gave you this new meaning perception, or a perspective, this new meaning. Oh, this is just an old thing when it's coming up. You know, previously it was wrong, bad, no, can't, resist, persists, lock it down. And now it's like, no, when that happens, love, welcome, accept, appreciate, allow. And then it changes over time. Your relationship to that activation in your body changes over time. And then the activation itself might go away, but at the very least, the sort of like the compounding impact of being reactive against the activation starts to go away. And then again, at the very least, you start to process those moments in ways that's smoother, less disruptive to your life.